Hello, everyone. How are you? Welcome to the second episode of Echoes by Serene. Echoes presents a unique take on change making in inclusion and belonging. It combines knowledge from history with the wisdom of thought leadership. It seeks to qualify the case for equity and access by understanding historical trends of discrimination and their profound impact on our modern lives. And we are your hosts, Anisha, Posh, and DEI expert at Serene.
And Ishani, founder and CEO at Serene. As you know, at Serene, we create equitable workplace experiences for an increasingly plural and diversified workforce and their innovations. Our guest today for this episode of Echoes is Dr. Lee Badgett, a groundbreaking economist and a close friend. Professor Badgett is the chief economist and co-founder of COPA, the LGBTI+ Economic Power Lab. In addition, she is also Professor Emeritus of Economics and the former Director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Welcome, Professor Badgett.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
To start off, could you please tell us a little bit about the broad areas of your research into the economic lives of LGBTQIA individuals and how it can have an impact on everyone else as well?
I should first say, as you noted, I'm an economist, and so I've been very interested in questions about economic inequality and being LGBTI QIA+. I usually just go for the LGBTI+ version of that. And in economics, in labor economics, the field that I study, we're very interested in looking at different kinds of economic outcomes to see if people have the same kind of outcomes. So we look to see if people have the same wages or earnings or income, which all kind of capture more or less the same thing. We're very interested in seeing whether or not any differences that are there, if they are related to other characteristics of those people or not. So what we've learned from research that I've done and that lots of other people have done is that actually when we look at gay and bisexual men, because those are people we often have data on, we see they actually earn less than heterosexual men do, even when you take into account differences in age and where people are living and their other kinds of background, their education, other kinds of background characteristics. Because we think that people who have the same characteristics should be treated more or less equally by employers, unless there's discrimination. And so if we see those differences, when we see those differences, I guess I should say, we think that there's probably something going on there that reflects how employers are treating gay and bisexual men. When we look at women, at cisgender women who are lesbian or bisexual and compare them to women who are heterosexual, we see a different pattern, which I think is very interesting. We could talk for a long time about all these, but basically we see that lesbian and bisexual women tend to earn more than heterosexual women do. And I don't think that's because it's heterosexual women who are facing discrimination compared to lesbian and bisexual women. But it's that all women earn less, and heterosexual women in particular tend to be at the bottom of the economic ladder. And I will say this has been true, these patterns for men, gay and bisexual men earning less, and for bisexual and lesbian women earning more. We see those in lots of different countries and lots of different studies. So we wanted to know, one of the things that's important to know is why is it that lesbian and bisexual women do appear to do better than straight women do. We think it's because they're more committed to the labor force. They know they're not going to have a male partner to be the breadwinner of their families, or to combine earnings with a man, and so it seems to have resulted in lesbians in particular being getting more experience in the labor market and being more maybe more willing to try things that heterosexual women aren't. So they take different kinds of jobs and don't take as much time off when they have kids, things like that. So there are some differences there. So that's the main one that I've looked at. You asked about what kind of effect that those inequalities have. Well, they can have obviously a big effect on the LGBT people themselves. But one of the things that I think is really important to think about is that when employers are discriminating, they're not fully using people's skills and knowledge and creativity. That's what we call human capital in economics. So they're leaving something on the table. They're not fully using LGBT people to their full capability, and so that holds back the economy. If we were treated more equally, more fairly, we'd probably we might be more productive. We would probably have better health because poor economic outcomes are bad for your health. Poor treatment, discrimination is bad for your health. So there are all sorts of reasons why we might see inequalities resulting in bad outcomes for everybody, for economies as a whole.
That is, as I was saying before we started recording, that's probably one of the most interesting bodies of research that I've come across because at least in my research that I have done academically, has been a lot around women, heterosexual women, and their histories. Thinking about gender and sexuality and how that impacts economies and also individual economic outcomes and prospects. That's something that I have never come across, and that's really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing your work with us. So coming back to the inequities that LGBTQIA plus people continue to face in the world. It's a well-established fact that for us common people who do not really are not involved in academia as much, we see popular media as something that really influences our behavior and the way we perceive people, the way we treat people. And popular media has for ages been perpetuating a lot of harmful stereotypes about the community, right? Like movies and TV shows are still continuing to portray people from the community as flamboyant, going to like really high end parties, wearing really luxurious fashion, and all of that stuff. That's also something that you have worked on, a stereotype called gay affluence, and which is the idea that members of the LGBTQIA plus community exist within economically privileged and urban social classes. And there are, of course, people who have had those kinds of life experiences. While researching for this video, when I went and looked at some of the most influential people in the community, the first person that came up was Anderson Cooper. And then we also have Rose Cleveland, who is the sister of President Grover Cleveland. So all of these people are, of course, have had extremely elite experiences in life. However, that is the exception and not the rule. And probably one of the most well-known examples of this, and something that has been written about a lot, is the cowboys in the Old West in post-Civil War America. And I mean, they were definitely not rubbing any elbows with the big industrial hobnobs of New York. So and a lot has been discussed about their experiences of queerness and same-sex love. So basically, what I want to ask is, when realities are so starkly different, the real life experiences of people from the community are so starkly different from what is known to us through popular media. Where does this historically entrenched stereotype of gay affluence come from? And as you mentioned, you have spoken about the impact of this stereotype in brief previously, but what can you elaborate on the impact of it, negative or positive impact of it on the economic standing of people from the community?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's hard to know where it really comes from. I think there's always been a related stereotype about LGBTI people being more creative, writers and entertainers who were known to be, to at least some people, maybe they had same-sex partners um, or both same-sex and different-sex partners. So, that's not that's something that's been around for a long time. Human sexuality has always been very diverse, and I think the modern version of it is interesting because there's a lot more behind it. At least in the U.S., we saw two things behind it. I think, getting beyond that stereotype of creativity. One of the things was it became in the interest of people to promote that stereotype. The people who were trying to develop, gay LGBT newspapers, or we just called them gay newspapers back in the day, newspapers and uh, magazines and organizations sometimes wanted to make the people who are their readers look affluent so that advertisers would buy ads. Basically, when it gets right down to it, it's very clear motivation. So they did some of their own research because there wasn't data back then, until fairly recently in most countries. They did their own research on the people who read their newspapers and said, "Oh, look how affluent our readers are," advertised in our newspaper, which is probably not. It's probably not an incorrect thing to say. In and of itself, it's not really a stereotype. It reflects their readership. But does it reflect the whole LGBTI community? Probably not, because we know that people who read those old instruments, newspapers, those old things that we used to read, that they do tend to have higher levels of education, and that means they're probably higher earners. So, uh, but because they were trying to promote this image, they tried to get the word out there as far and wide as they could. So it'd show up in more mainstream media, reporting on this affluent group of people, who are very fashionable and have great clothes and fancy apartments and that sort of thing. And people kind of, it just, it didn't really strike people as anything odd. When I heard about that stereotype, I'm like, that makes no sense at all. I studied discrimination against women and people of color in the U.S. when I was a grad student, and I knew that results in lower incomes, not higher incomes. So it never made any sense to me. I had to find some better data to show that was in fact a myth. So some of that came from the marketing side, but then at about the same time. We saw in the early 1990s in the U.S. we saw a big wave of efforts to limit the rights of LGBTI people. We didn't have a lot of rights back then, but to make that even more extreme, and then it became a political tool to say to voters or to people in our legislatures, look at this group of people. They're not a real minority. They are, they're doing just fine. They don't need protections in the law. And, so it was something that was promoted a lot by opponents of LGBTI rights. And I think, then the academics come along and say, okay, let's do a better job of this. And we've shown that the patterns are really wrong. But that myth persists. I think, I think that partly reflects really in lots of parts of the world how segregated our social spaces are. People who are well educated and hang out with other people like them are going to see other people. The gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people they run into are going to be relatively affluent, and there certainly are some very wealthy LGBTI people. It's just not that common, and it's less common than to see poverty. It's less common than to see people being middle class. So yeah, so exactly, I definitely think of that as a stereotype, and it has been used to hold LGBTI people back in the U.S. I'm not sure how much it's been used in other countries. To be honest, you might have a sense of whether or not that's something that you hear a lot about in India, but it's a stereotype. It's just doesn't really reflect who we are as a community.
Yeah, I think in India we probably don't. I mean, we've had members of the community in our history for a very, very long time. Initially, like maybe like in medieval times, they did have a lot of political power and a lot of artistic, again, were involved in a lot of arts. But like of late, like post independence, there was a lot of like poverty that is associated with the community. However, I think of late, as the movement has picked up, people from more affluent classes have joined the movement for LGBTQIA plus liberation, and that has led to a lot of mainstream discourses about them being from a particular class and them being affluent and having privilege, and again, not being a real minority. So yeah, that's definitely there. But what is so if members of the community who are a part of the workforce are not affluent, they are working class or middle class or whatever, how does this sort of stereotype then affect them economically in the workplace or as in their prospects?
Yeah, the stereotype itself, I think, can certainly, I think, make people feel like they aren't fully part of the community if they don't have a lot of money. People to go to the fancy bars and events and that sort of thing. So I think it can certainly create a class divide within the movement and within the community. I think, how does it affect people in the workplace? Sometimes it makes people a little bit invisible. I think maybe people don't have the stereotype that somebody who works in a factory might be LGBT, or that somebody who's a you know a kind of a clerical worker, because a lot of the push on DEI for LGBTI people, the diversity, equity, and inclusion space has really focused much more and has come more from people who are at higher levels of corporate hierarchies, people who are a little bit more visible, and so I think it can also invisibilize people who don't match that profile. Now, for some LGBTI people, that's what they want. They don't want to be very visible in terms of their sexual orientation or gender identity, but they are, that question about being in the closet is a complicated one. Sometimes we think of that as just being, you just don't talk about yourself. You just don't talk about your family life or whatever. But really, in a workplace where everybody talks about their families all the time, it takes effort to hold back. And you feel weird, and people treat you like you're a little odd if you don't ever talk about what you did over a weekend. So being in a closet, is something that can be very damaging for people psychologically, and it can sometimes hurt their position in the workplace if people think they're odd and don't understand, don't become very friendly with them. Um, the other kinds of strategies that people have for managing what's a stigmatized identity, for managing that in the workplace can also involve other things that are, complicated, like inventing a heterosexual persona that you talk about, or sometimes people will do things like they'll talk about their same-sex partner, but they'll give them the name of a woman, a lesbian will give the name of a man as their partner. There certainly are, people worry a lot about discrimination, and so they're willing to spend that kind of time and energy to try to hide that and to only let that out to people that they get to know and trust. So I think that's still a very prominent feature of workplaces all over the world. I mean, I think some of the figures that I've seen in places like India, but even the U.S. show that half or more of LGBTI people are not out in their workplaces, even now. So, is that tied directly to the stereotype of affluence? Maybe not, but it's tied. It's all part and parcel of the unwillingness to make a workplace welcoming to people who are LGBTI to just be themselves. And that's another piece of that economic argument about why we aren't, if we can't bring our whole selves into our jobs, then there's something that's going to be missing as a result of that.
This is very interesting what you say, Lee. It really touched me that everyday lives, how we take it for granted, right? As a heterosexual person, I'm able to say that, my partner is picking me up. My husband is picking me up from work. I'm going out for dinner. This is what I'm going to cook for my child. I'm talking about my holidays that I have taken. It's just the smallest things that make it so comfortable, right? And if you do not have that, it's hard. It's very hard in everyday life as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it means something different too. Even when people, talk about their families, if a heterosexual person talks about their spouse or their kids, it's just it's just your family life. If sometimes if an LGBTI person talks about their partners, their same-sex partners, or families, then it's like, ooh, you're talking about sex. We don't want you to talk about that in the workplace. That's not appropriate for you to talk about the workplace. But it's the same thing, it's just one person says it and it means one thing, and another person says it and it means something else.
I notice these things that when you go into somebody's workspace, they set it up as their own. They put their personal things, and most often there will be a photo of your husband or your family, and it's a nicely framed. But oftentimes you'll see LGBTI individuals will not do that. Will keep that photo away in a wallet or something, right?
Yeah. Because they're risking something, that you lose control over that ability to manage your identity. It's there for everybody to see, and it's for people. It could be a big step to make a decision to do that, because once you do that, it's really hard to go back in the closet. So you're making that commitment, and so yeah, it is a big deal.
To dive a little bit deeper into occupational segregation that you have worked on. You have often talked about that how historically lesbian women who have entered into a profession are often termed masculine, right? Or gay men would be drawn into work which would be considered feminine. Now, for example, one of them would be the United States Women's Army Corps, and they have this long-standing history of having lesbian cadets, right? Now, these identities of gay and lesbian individuals, they cannot be within the watertight gender and sexual binaries, right? The occupational segregation does exist. Now, they would, but oftentimes they would have to still work within these black and white structure and choose a side in order to survive, right? Now, if that is the case, but today people are increasingly getting used to the idea of fluid identities, not this black and white structure that we have imposed. Now, my question to you is, does this growing awareness translate to gay and lesbian workers' access to diverse jobs and hopefully higher economic brackets?
It's a great question. It's a new topic that we've only been able to start studying pretty recently as we've gotten better data in some countries. We still don't have it in many places. We don't have very good data in India, for example. Um, I think, yeah, our workplaces are very much places where gender gets created, and that gender binary is built in. It's just baked into our economies. In most, I think probably, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, in every economy that I know of, where that studied occupational segregation, most women work in jobs that have mostly women in them, and most men work in jobs that have mostly men in them, and so it's interesting to think. Well, what if you were LGBT? Would you want to make those same kinds of decisions to lean into a gendered occupation that's consistent with your own gender identity, or not? And we do see, it's kind of like that pattern that you started up mentioning. We do see that although men are mostly in jobs with other men, if they're gay, there are more women in those jobs that they're in. Right? There's a higher percentage of women in those jobs. And for the lesbians, there's a higher percentage of men in the jobs that they are in. So they are kind of like, you could, I think, kind of look at it as an attempt to maybe break down those barriers between the different kinds of occupations, because there's often a bit of what the employer wants, that kind of segregates people, but it's also a little bit of what people want in terms of the jobs, what workers want in terms of the jobs that they're looking for. So it's a little bit hard to know, so so it could be, there's just more interest of lesbians in jobs that men have because they pay more. There could be more interest of gay men in jobs that have more women in them because women are more open and accepting of gay men. So there's that kind of possibility. Other people have argued that it might be more about other different characteristics of the job, like is it possible to more easily kind of manage your decisions about coming out or not. So if you work in a job where you have a lot of autonomy, where you might work with other people, but that you don't really depend on them. So if you come out in a situation like that and people freak out, start treating you badly, you can still do your job. So that might help people be more likely to come out. It could just be, there's other ideas that people have about this, is that by having this kind of hypervigilance that often LGBTI people have, they're always thinking, am I safe in this position? Can I come out to this person? Always scanning the environment and keeping track of things, that it might make us more maybe we might be better able to read people's feelings, so maybe that's helpful in certain kinds of jobs. Might be helpful in a sales job, might be helpful in, jobs where, you have to work with people in a really challenging kinds of situation. So it could be that, it becomes a little bit of a training ground or something for developing different kinds of skills. So it's hard to know. It's hard to know how much of that is really about really wanting to break down those gender barriers, but they are there. And we do see them really limiting access to jobs for LGBT people. So we do see employers gatekeeping jobs that have that employers think of as being more traditionally male. In studies where gay men try to get those jobs, they are less likely to be invited for an interview for jobs like that, for example. And for lesbians, there's some studies that show that for jobs that are, have more women in them, that they have a harder time getting access to those jobs. So there's definitely some gatekeeping that happens. Gay men are seen as very feminine potentially in many cases, and lesbians as masculine, and maybe that's some of it, as you were saying. That could very well be a piece of it. So it's one of those really interesting things. It's probably not just one of those explanations, is my guess. It's probably a lot of those different factors are playing a role, kind of sorting people out into different kinds of jobs.
Very much. This is very interesting, and you talked a little bit about pay disparity as well. That part is, I mean, extremely prevalent when it comes to Southeast Asia, I would say as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you see any trends in pay disparity? Are these numbers actually available?
Not really. This is the really hard thing. We don't have many data sets where we can sort of look over time to see how things are changing, and we don't have mostly the data that we have on LGBT identified people come from English speaking countries in the global north. We're starting to get more data from developing countries like in Latin America. In South Asia, it's the data quality that we have is, I would say, at least a little bit better for thinking about people who are, identify as gender minorities, because the census and labor force surveys have a third gender option. So it's not just male or female, but there's that other option. It's not really clear who all the other people are, but they are. But they're at least people that we can identify and make comparisons with. And actually, I'm working with a student, Hia Rajput, who is interested in these questions, and we're trying to look at some of the labor force survey data from India to see if we can see inequalities for people who are who identify as other as opposed to male or female. And what we're finding so far is that they tend to be somewhere in the middle, actually, between women's outcomes on things like labor force participation. People categorized as other are much more likely to be in the labor force, and we can't measure wages, unfortunately, but we can see that they are they have a harder time getting into more formal sector jobs, for example. So we're trying to sort out how it's hard to know why. But we do at least see that the other category folks are somewhere in between male and female in terms of those outcomes.
Exactly going to be our next question. We really wanted to kind of understand a little bit deeper into this stereotypes and how it plays out. Now, we know that gay men are stereotyped having traditionally feminine qualities, and lesbian women would be viewed more traditionally male and treated differently in the workplace. But now, what is the impact of this segregation on more fluid identities as per your research, let's say on transgender people? So, our question would be, how do biases that perpetuate occupational segregation economically impact transgender workers and their career prospects?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question. We don't yet have data where we can really measure that very precisely in terms of how much occupational segregation there is for transgender people. But we have a couple of studies, one from the Netherlands, one from the U.S., and a few others from the U.S. that suggest that it's complicated for transgender people, that there may be two things that are at play here. One is that being transgender is stigmatized. So when people transition in the workplace or in the social security system, where we get some of this data from the Netherlands and more recently from the US, when they start doing that and become more visible as transgender people, at least for a while, you might expect them to experience discrimination because of that. But then, excuse me, we might see other kinds of effects. So for people who are trans men who were assigned female at birth, but have a gender identity as male, we sometimes see them moving into jobs that are that are more traditionally male jobs. Those are the ones that are higher paying. So there's kind of an offsetting effect. So if you're more visible as being transgender, but you're able to access more higher paying jobs, those will balance out, and we don't see a really huge change in the wages of transgender men as they transition. For trans women, though, on the other hand, we see that that transgender effect or transition effect could be negative, and they may be moving into jobs where there are more women, and that might explain why we see a big drop in their earnings as they transition. And we see that later on too in surveys where we're just looking at people at a point in time. We're not following them over time. But we see those same kinds of patterns where transgender women tend to have really much poorer outcomes than cisgender people do, and transgender men, to some extent, in some surveys, do seem to also have much poorer economic outcomes, especially if they are kind of. If they transition later in life and maybe were seen as being female for a long time, even though their gender identity was male, and if they were treated as women, then they're kind of in a worse economic position. So it can get kind of complicated to put those pieces together, and they won't necessarily be the same for trans men and trans women. For non-binary people, we only have a little bits and pieces of data to look at folks who are non-binary. Some studies do show that they are also facing a kind of gender non-conformity penalty or something like that. We just see the numbers. We don't know so much exactly what's happening there, but they do tend to do worse economically as well. All those data are mostly either from the U.S. or from Northern Europe. So, how widely that will apply to folks in other countries, it's really hard to say. But that's why, can I do my data commercial now? That's why we need more data. I think this is a really important an important area that national statistics offices need to learn more about, and I think it's a project for the LGBTI communities and allies to start working on, talking about the need for better data and getting statistics offices to take that on. Because we're a fairly small minority, you've got to have a really big survey, and it's really usually only governments that have those kinds of resources to do that. So that's why it's very important, and important for governments to care about inequality and to track it over time and see if we're doing better over time. So better data would make a big difference.
I think in India, the last survey that we had introduced the third gender. That's a very, very broad category of people. But I think there's just one census that we have data on the quote unquote third gender currently. So, yeah, there's no way of tracking progress because we haven't had the next census after that.
Even on identity cards, right? It was for the first time introduced so people could travel. You could not take a train, right? Because it was not on your identity card.
Yeah. That's a really very important kind of way that the government statistics and administrative data, could also be enhanced. I mean, that's usually that's not the way we get most of the data about who's out there in the world, but making it possible for transgender people to get ID cards that match their gender identity is really important for getting a job. It's really important for getting access to travel and access to Social Security benefits in many countries. So that's also a big issue.
Yeah. I mean, in my interactions with transgender people, I mean, this is completely anecdotal, not rooted in any kind of study or data, but from my interactions with them, I am friends with a trans man, and when he transitioned and he entered the workforce, it was an entry level job, and he had a really good experience because people at work would like take him seriously and take his opinions seriously and his ideas seriously, and he felt like he could really thrive in the workplace. Whereas trans women that I've spoken to always feel like they are either the butt of the joke or are extremely are subjected to a lot of harassment at work, which is a completely different experience from like the two individuals that I've spoken to, and I've always wondered about how that really impacts their career progression as they move forward through the years. So yeah, this is really, really interesting and something that we all need to think about and look into, and probably a top-down influence from the government also is really, really important and essential to bring this about.
Yeah, yeah, probably both of those things, the government policy and laws, but also, kind of doing a better job of educating people about why, why it's important to be more accepting of people, to just, whatever their gender identity or sexual orientation identity.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so, again, speaking about what we need to do more, how we can bring about change, of late, maybe in the past 10 years, a lot of organizations and corporations around the world have begun addressing issues of exclusion regarding the LGBTI community. And we've just had Pride Month passes by, and that's the time where a lot of organizations do show their appreciation for members of the community within their workforce a lot more. And we've had companies changing their colors to pride colors, and we've had a lot of visibility campaigns that happen on social media or within organizations internally. Now, this is in my living memory, I have grown up as a teenager into adulthood in the past 10 years. And when I look back 10 years ago when I was in high school, none of this was a mainstream thing. But having said that, there is a lot more that we need to do still. Like you said, occupational segregation still exists. It still impacts the experiences, the workplace experiences, the economic standing of members of the community. So, what can organizations do, if anything, to tackle systemic and socially entrenched barriers like occupational segregations and institute real equity for members of the community? And what's in it for them? Because a lot of people, a lot of organizations in our daily work also ask, why is it important for us to address this? We've been working for years without having addressed this. Why is it important now?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, you all are the experts on this. In India, of course. I think there have been a couple of different ways of approaching these kinds of questions. I think mostly they're not thinking about systemic change, structural change. I think mostly it's about individual employers and thinking about the list of policies that they should have around non-discrimination, the list of types of benefits that they should have for same-sex partners or for gender-affirming care, the list of tools that they might use, doing diversity training that includes LGBTI issues. So there are all those kinds of things, which I think are very important. I don't know how well they are moving us towards that kind of larger systemic change. I mean, for one thing, it can't just be a handful of employers. It has to be everybody. because if all employers are not required to live up to those same standards by the law, then we're kind of leaving it up to the market to enforce that. And sometimes that works. Sometimes employers will do the right thing because they know if they don't, they may not be able to hire the people that they want to hire. They may not be able to hang on to people they've trained, and so that's part of the business case for LGBTI equality. Thinking about how it could be costly to lose people or not be able to hire folks. Maybe they will not be as appealing to certain kinds of customers who are LGBTI or who have friends or family members who are, people who are allies. And so that can hold back revenue for businesses. So it can hit them on the bottom line. And that is something that we see. We've seen research, again, mainly in the US, taking databases of companies that have different policies and showing that the ones who had the most LGBTI inclusive policies are the ones who have higher stock prices, higher profits, higher productivity. So there are those kinds of studies that confirm that business case, that say yes, it is better for businesses. So those things are all very important. But again, getting it at that structural piece of it, it's not very clear. I mean, we've worked for a much longer period of time in lots of parts of the world to try to do a better job of breaking down those barriers for women, and it's been very hard. I don't think it will necessarily be easier for LGBT people, except for the fact that some LGBT people are men, so they may have other kinds of characteristics of privilege, whether it's their class background or caste background or their the schools that they went to, the universities they went to, things that do give some people a little more privilege and a step up. But on average, they're still going to have a tougher time than the straight men do who have those same kinds of characteristics. At least that's what the research shows us. So so I think it's one of those things where we start off. I think we start off with some ideas about what will help, and then we realize it's not quite enough. So then we have to start thinking about what else we do. What's next? I think one of the tools that employers could use, and in some places, some big multinationals are starting to use these tools, is to collect data and to see, are they really actually hiring LGBTI people or not? If you give your employees the opportunity to self-disclose, many of them will. So there are big employers who've done that. So that gives you a tool. Then you can say, well, we're doing well in this city, but not so much in this one, or this country, not this one, or this type of job, but not this one, and can start to try to unpack that. But employers don't always have a big incentive to do that unless they've got that pressure from either public policymakers or from their customers, or often from their workers. Unionized workplaces give employees an opportunity to actually negotiate with employers and maybe push them to do things that unions want to see. These are we actually don't have. Unions are less important, play a less important role in most parts of the United States economy right now, but they're still there and important in like the public sector, in government jobs, for example. So the other way that governments can help set the standard is to do a good job themselves as public employers, to hire and promote and try to break down those barriers for LGBTI people and for women and other disadvantaged groups too. So so we have tools, that those are at least some that we know that can work. Working out other ways of providing training that will make a difference. Putting some of the things that research show that matter a lot are, the training works really well, especially when you have accountability mechanisms for management, for managers who are doing hiring and promotions, that they will pay more attention and try to do a better job of making sure their departments are run in a fair and equal way. So those are things that we can do. We can do for LGBTI people also.
This is excellent, and I think a lot of our listeners will also have a lot of things to think about what you said. And one of the things that makes me a little bit positive is that what Anisha said, it's been her teenage to adult years, the last 10 years, but that's been my career, last 10 years in this field, and I have seen a lot of change. Even countries in Southeast Asia, they're scrapping certain laws which have been there since the colonial history, and we're finally saying that finally this year we're saying that this is not good anymore. So I want to dive into one last topic which we rarely talk about, would be about intersectionality. As Anisha was talking about, so much of our beliefs and how we treat people come from the media. And if you look at any Hollywood movie, either you would see in a group of people either a man, either a woman, or maybe somebody from an LGBTIA community, or you would see somebody of color. You would never see in all of these things together, right? You rarely see a person from an LGBTI community who is also a person of color, right? And it's so evident in the workplace as well. We were looking at a study together by the Boston Consulting Group, and we looked at people who about the study, and we saw that only 28% of people of color within the under 35 group. And the number fell to such a low number when it went to above 55, and it turned out it was only 2% of people of color in the workplace who reported. Now, this is stark, and when you look at the community itself, there are people who have talked about their own experience of discrimination. We were talking about poet Rex Hemphill, who talks about his own experience of discrimination as an African American gay man. Now, there are so many of these things that are to be talked about when it comes to intersectionality, but what we wanted to ask you was, is there a difference in LGBTQIA labor experience in terms of wage gaps or in terms of occupational segregation when explored from the intersection of race and ethnicity?
There are, and that's a very important question because people are complicated. We have multiple identities, and many of those will, the ones that are more marginalized might push in the same direction. So we might think that the people who have, who are LGBTI, who are women, who are racial or ethnic minority groups, will have an even harder time than just folks who only have one marginalized identity, like a gay man, a white gay man. And the research has pretty much confirmed that those different identities all shape at the same time many economic outcomes. So the ones that have been studied have to do with wages. So if we look at wage gaps, we see that white LGBT people tend to earn more than black LGBT people or Latino LGBT people in the United States. And we also see, when we compare black LGBT people to black heterosexual people, that the black LGBT people tend to do worse than black heterosexual people. So if you kind of think about the challenges that people face, it looks like they're all relevant in more or less the same kind of way in most situations for people in these different groups, and that having more than one marginalized identity will put you in a tougher position for the most part. We've seen this in the context of poverty rates in the U.S. also. LGBTI people as a whole, have a higher poverty rate than the U.S. population as a whole. The groups that are most affected by that, and this is a whole other level of kind of, I guess this is less intersectionality and more disaggregation. But if you pull apart the LGBTI community, as you were kind of talking about before, we see really high poverty rates for transgender people in particular. When we divide that up by race and ethnicity, again, we see that same pattern. It's really white people are have lower poverty rates if they're LGBT. Let me put it this way: if they're just looking at LGBT people, white LGBTs have lower poverty rates than Black and Latino LGBT people. We see it in occupational segregation. There's even, the patterns of segregation are complicated, and there's still segregation by race and ethnicity as well as by sex. So we also see African American and Latino American people who are LGBT pushed into jobs that pay lower earnings. So it all makes a difference. It all makes a difference.
That's
Yeah, I mean, I have been doing a bit of research into different words that people in India use for lesbian, gay, transgender, etc., in Indian vernacular languages. And something very interesting that I came across was that the LGBTI plus movement in India is very urban centric, and it's very it's dominated by the upper castes, and they will often refer to themselves as lesbian or gay or transgender and so on. But members of the community who live in more rural areas, belong to lower caste communities, have more vernacular terminologies that they use to refer to themselves. And those words are used very pejoratively in urban settings. So that is sort of like a marginalization of their identities and their cultural experiences as well. So yeah, this the whole intersectionality of experiences are so important for everyone, and also for the LGBTI community as well. Thank you for sharing your insights. This was really amazing, such an enriching conversation we've had, and I think our listeners will also have something to take away from this. Um, uh, I think in our work to establish equity and inclusion in human experiences, be it in society or in the workplace, it is very important to emphasize the seismic changes we are looking to bring to the world. At one hand, these changes might just be influencing the minute aspects of an individual's daily life. And on the other hand, they also bring about big impact in world economies, like you mentioned. So, thank you for joining us for this episode, and thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. Keep having conversations, keep making change, and remember your histories.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.